Today, everyone woke up and Bitcoin is back over $50,000. It means that Bitcoin is now closer to $100,000 than it is to zero. If we go ahead and we look, we've got a ton of data around why Bitcoin is such an incredible asset. It is the apex predator of financial markets. First, we can see today that Bitcoin over $50,000, up a little over 4%. Every single other asset that you can consider is basically non-volatile in comparison. Volatility is not good or bad. If you are holding an asset and it is volatile to the upside, that is a good thing. If you are holding an asset and it's volatile to the downside, that's a bad thing. So volatility on its own is not good or bad. It depends on how you are positioned in the market. And so these other assets have a lack of volatility. You can see oil up 1.77%. You can see gold up similar. You can also see that things like the euro and the yen barely moving at all. Bitcoin happens to move much, much more. And so therefore, over long periods of time, if it appreciates, that volatility works in your favor. If we then go ahead and we look at specific stats around the Bitcoin network itself, today we sit just under $950 billion in market cap. Bitcoin was launched January 3rd, 2009, and in about 12 years, we have gone all the way up to $950 billion market cap. It's pretty impressive. Right now, the inflation rate is 1.78%. The US dollar inflation rate on a CPI basis is over 5%. The core inflation rate is over 4%. And so Bitcoin's inflation rate is much, much more attractive than the legacy system. About 89.6% of all Bitcoin has already been issued of the 21 million total. In the last 24 hours, there was $18 billion of Bitcoin that was settled on the blockchain. This is not exchange traded volume, simply on the blockchain. In the blocks of transactions, there was $18 billion. There's been about 7 days total of over $20 billion of settlement that's ever occurred on the Bitcoin blockchain. So very, very high rate of settlement happening right now. You also can see there's about $7 billion of exchange traded volume. This is going on to places like Coinbase, Gemini, BlockFi, etc., and actually buying and selling Bitcoin. There's over 1 million active addresses in the last 24 hours. So whenever somebody says nobody uses Bitcoin, well, there was 1 million people, 1 million addresses that used it yesterday. On top of that, the Bitcoin miners yesterday were paid almost $46 million as part of the mining reward. Miners get paid through two specific ways. The first revenue stream, which makes up the majority of their revenue, is through the mining reward. That is the 900 Bitcoin that came into circulation yesterday. On top of that, they also get transaction fees. Transaction fees are a small percentage of the revenue today, but the thought process is over time, those will grow to become larger and larger. But yesterday, in the last 24 hours, Bitcoin miners made almost $46 million in top line revenue. And then we can see that Bitcoin is up 72% from the cycle low, and it's still trading at 22% below the all-time high. And if we go and we look over the last 1, 3, 5, and 10 years, what we can see is that Bitcoin has continued to appreciate very rapidly. It has outperformed gold and the S&P. Gold is down 8% over the last year. Gold is down 1% over the last 9 years. Bitcoin's performance is unlike anything that has ever happened in financial markets before. It is very, very special. If we start to look at the Bitcoin price closing history by various levels, we can see that Bitcoin over the last year or so has only traded above the current level 73 days in the history of Bitcoin. So if you bought Bitcoin 88.4% of days of Bitcoin's life, you have more purchasing power today than you did before. So again, 98%. If you bought Bitcoin 98% of days since Bitcoin was created, you have more purchasing power today than you ever have before. And that's 73 days above current price levels is all in this year. So anyone who has been a long-term holder of Bitcoin has been able to protect their purchasing power and actually increase it, rather than if you hold legacy assets, you actually have seen a depreciation or a devaluation of that purchasing power. If you go all the way back to $30,000 price level, we've only ever spent 275 days of the entire life cycle of Bitcoin, less than 6% of the time above 30,000. So we are in uncharted territory. But what it shows you is that if you are a long-term holder of this asset, historically, it has proven to be very, very effective. History is not necessarily an indicator of future performance, but it is quite a good point to pay attention to. And lastly, we have this idea of comparing Bitcoin to the various indexes and assets. And what you can see in this chart here is comparing Bitcoin, gold, the S&P 500, NASDAQ, and treasuries. If you look at that ROI, of course, Bitcoin drastically outperforming. Bitcoin up about 365% or so in the last year. If you look at something like gold, it's down 8%. If you look at the stock, it's just over 25%. But what I'm most interested in this chart here is if you go to the CAGR, C-A-G-R, compound annual growth rate over the 10-year period, Bitcoin has grown at 155% compound annual growth rate. That means that every year, on average, over a 10-year period, it's gone up 155%. And so when you compound 155% growth every year for a decade, you get the best performing asset in the history of financial markets. If you compare that to something like the S&P 500 or NASDAQ, those are both down under 20 and under 15%. Even gold being down just at 0.6%. So Bitcoin's performance is incredibly dominant. That is why we call it the apex predator of financial markets. If you then look at the Sharpe ratio as well, very, very high Sharpe ratios over a 1 and a 5 year period. And when you think about a Sharpe ratio, that simply is saying if you put this asset into a portfolio, when you compound the return profile, when you compare the correlation levels and the Sharpe ratios, Bitcoin can do very special things for a portfolio, even if you only have a small allocation. And so we will continue to watch this because we think that Bitcoin is going to become one of the most important, if not the most important financial asset in the world. And it's important to remember that there is a ton of market participants and trillions of dollars that are all swirling around in the financial market trying to find a home. And Bitcoin is likely to continue to suck up a lot of that value.